Cheers. Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. Some pretty incredible things have happened this week. For a start, I'm getting some new Blu-rays delivered for review for the channel, so it's going to be a lot of fun. Secondly, my bowel screening kit came up negative, which is good. And thirdly, the channel made 10,000 subscribers. Now that's extraordinary. That is mind-blowing. This is what 10,000 looks like. Thank you very, very, very much to everybody who's subscribed to the channel. It means a lot to me. It's an extraordinary thing. It's not something I thought I would ever be doing with my life. But here I am talking about movies and getting people to talk back to me, and I love that. So the next video I do after this one, which will come out in the middle of the week, will be the big celebration one. But this one I already had pre-planned, and it's about a couple of very sick cinematic puppies from the 1960s. First off, we have Michael Powell's wonderful Peeping Tom, starring Carl Baum, Anna Massey, and Moira Shearer. This is a dead-set legend of a movie, and I love it a lot. And it's got some very weird backstory as well. Then there is this one, which has only just come out from Umbrella Entertainment a couple of months ago. It's a limited edition of 1000, and it's a movie I'd heard about. I knew the music from, definitely, because there's some great Bernard Herrmann music in it. But I hadn't actually seen it until I watched it this time. Twisted Nerve with Hugh Bennett and Billy Whitelaw and Hayley Mills. And it is pretty damn good. Now, this one's got the J card on it, but I'll talk about that later. So let's get started with Peeping Tom. Now, we all know Powell and Pressburger. You know, they did Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. They did Black Narcissus. They did a whole bunch of other films. I Know Where I'm Going. If you want to look for really cool 1940s and 1950s films, you couldn't go past Emmerich Pressburger and Michael Powell. Now, Michael Powell stepped out on his own in 1960 and came up with a film that really punched his career in the tummy, a movie called Peeping Tom. It was lambasted. I'll talk about that probably a little bit later. I'm getting ahead of myself. This one is a progenitor from modern slasher film. It is one of the slasher films. There's not a lot of blood and guts in it, but its whole feel and the way it approaches its material and the story it tells is a definite progenitor to slasher films as we know them today. Funnily enough, both Peeping Tom and Twisted Nerve were written by the same guy, a guy called Leo Marx, who had an extraordinary life. He was a polymath, incredibly clever guy. During World War II, he was part of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, on the Allied side during World War II. He also worked at Bletchley Park along with people like Alan Turing because he had a real keen interest and a great talent for cryptography. And he then went on after the war to write some screenplays. He co-wrote the screenplay for a movie called Guns at Batazi with Richard Attenborough, which is really good. And he wrote the scripts for not only Peeping Tom, but Twisted Nerve as well. It's based on someone else's story, but he wrote the scripts and added a lot of his own flavour to them. Now, Peeping Tom has a really interesting feel about it. If you look at it from a certain angle, and you don't have to tilt it very far to do that, it plays like an early Italian giallo movie. It's got a lot of the same tropes as a giallo. In it, you've got a young man called Mark Lewis, played by Carl Baum, who has a fetish for videography. And we see him right at the start expressing that. Now, the thing you need to know about Mark right off the bat is his primary sexual organ is a camera, which makes him something of a sick puppy. And he owns a large house and rents out various parts of the house as apartments to other people, though nobody, until he tells them, knows that he's the landlord. They just think he's the weird guy upstairs. One of the tenants is a young woman called Helen Stevens, played by Anna Massey, who lives in an apartment with her mother, who's blind, played by Maxine Audley. And blind women who are very perceptive is another thing that comes up in giallo movies. So Mark is basically a serial killer. He records on photographic video film the murders he commits in a very particular way. He has a fetish for it. It is his kink. And he then prints out the films himself in a laboratory he has at home and watches the movies. And you see a scene where he's watching the movie of him killing a sex worker who he kills at the start of the film. And rather than showing his sexual arousal, Michael Powell does a really interesting thing by having him stand up in his chair and then sit back down and then stand up again when he gets more excited. So there's a kind of parallel between something else there that's going on. And it's really interesting. Now, the young woman, Helen, is kind of attracted to Mark because he's not a bad-looking geezer. And so she tries to pull him out of his shell. She knows he's kind of withdrawn. She doesn't know why until it's slowly revealed why Mark is who and what he is. And so she tries to encourage him and kind of take him out and talk to him. And they go out on a kind of date where he doesn't take his camera for the first time because he always has his camera with him. He always has his bag of film with him. His daytime job is working as a focus puller at a movie studio. And we see him working at that. And his kind of side hustle is taking dirty photos in a studio above a tobacconist.
Nasty substances.
Now, I can get sidetracked in movies. I can dive deep. I can really go mad with movies sometimes. I love this tobacconist shop because there are a few things I like about it. First off, it's got naughty postcards all over it. So it's got those kind of saucy topless lady postcards all over it for some reason. It also has a whole bunch of Penguin paperbacks it sells. It's got the literary ones with the red spines. It's got the green ones, which are your crime novels. It's got all of that kind of stuff. And it sells fireworks and it sells dirty pictures. Leaving aside the tobacco, I like that place. It's really interesting. Now, the other thing I noticed, and again I'm deep diving and I'm going kind of a little bit mad, is the sex worker who takes Mark back to her digs tells him it's going to cost him £2.
It'll be £2.
Which is probably the going price at the time, who knows. But when a dirty old man, played by Miles Malleson, a very interesting old character, comes into the tobacconist and decides to buy a bunch of views.
I'm told by a friend that you have some views for sale.
What sort of views, sir?
Well,
which was the name they gave to portfolios of pornographic pictures. It's going to cost him £5. So basically, getting a book of dirty pictures costs 2.5 times as much as assignation with a sex worker. That's a weird kind of economics, and in our day, it shows how technology and the liaisons between men and women have changed. These days, you've got an app for one, and you've got a number of websites for the other. So it's kind of almost like looking at the prehistory of adult entertainment just by watching one aspect of this particular movie. Where Mark works at the movie studio, there is a stand-in for the main actress, a woman called Vivian, played by Moira Shearer, who had worked with Michael Powell in The Red Shoes and Tales of Hoffman. Fantastic dancer, brilliant, vivid actress. And she's got this deal with Mark where he's going to film her and use that as a kind of show reel so she can get better gigs from the movie studio and enhance her career. And I kind of like her character too because she's Moira Shearer. I mean, she is great. She's beautiful. She's talented. She moves wonderfully. She's a fantastic dancer. And she becomes one of Mark's victims, which is horrible. And it wouldn't be something that people would expect because Powell and Pressburger had used her in The Red Shoes, which has a very dark ending, come to think of it. In this one, she gets to do a really interesting dance sequence and it livens up the film and takes it into a different area when it's happening. And then Mark uses his really weird device to kill her while he's filming her. Meanwhile, the coppers start investigating these murders, of course. One played by Jack Watson, and the other one is somebody I talked about last week in the last video. Nigel Davenport turns up as Detective Sergeant Miller, another one of the coppers, and they're investigating these murders and trying to piece things together. But you've got two parallel things. You've got Mark as the murderer, as this twisted, sick bastard who is killing women, and also the Mark who, because of his relationship with Helen, is trying to find a way out of what he knows is the trap his life has led him into. And I like those parallel threads running there. And we find out why Mark is the way he is, because we see some film of Mark all through his childhood, where his father, a scientist played by the director of the film, Michael Powell, basically recorded every instant of the kid's life from birth, either through audio or through video. And this scientist's father was interested in the influences of fear on children and used his own child as the guinea pig for this. And then that, of course, leads us into the filmmaker being the father who films the child. And it doesn't quite break the fourth wall, but it gives us a meta aspect to this film, which is really kind of creepy. Is Michael Powell being a voyeur who passes on his voyeurism to us? Because there are a number of kinky aspects to this movie. He was lambasted at the time because people were expecting classy films from Michael Powell. And what he did instead was give them a horrible horror thriller with some incredibly deeply kinky sexual aspects and a device used to kill the women, which when you think about it is truly monstrous. Powell's career took a nosedive in the UK. He ended up coming to Australia and he made two films. He made They're a Weird Mob, based on John O'Grady's novel, and he also made Age of Consent with Helen Mirren. So both of those films didn't boost his career up. They were quite successful in their own right, but they didn't do a lot for Michael Powell. He ended up writing a couple of volumes of his autobiography. I've got one of them in the other room, and it's quite a good read finding out why Michael Powell did what he did with his career, how he did it, who he did it with. It's a very detailed and layered autobiography that he's put out in 2 volumes. But this movie tanked Michael Powell because the English weren't ready for it. They weren't ready to admit the kinkiness of English people. They weren't ready to admit that audiences wanted titillation as well. And there is actually some nudity in this film, only for a second or two, of a model, a photographic model called Pamela Green, who later went on to make 1 or 2 nudie films as well. But she was quite popular as a pin-up model at the time. So this movie is a masterpiece. It really does more even than Hitchcock's Psycho, which came out roughly the same time. They ran in parallel. It's a masterpiece of horror. Now, no disrespect to Psycho. I like Psycho, I like the twist in Psycho, I like the way that Hitchcock did it and also the way that it was influenced by Hitchcock's own proclivities. But for me, Peeping Tom has a lot more depth. It uses colour beautifully, it's bold in its concept, it's bold in the execution of that concept, and it also has a couple of quite funny moments, which is a little bit of a surprise. Nevertheless, this one is one you should have. Now, the version I've got isn't the best version of Peeping Tom. It's a Universal DVD that came out much more than a decade ago. It is in widescreen, and I'm not really in love with the quality of the print they struck this from. Doesn't have any extras in it. But yeah, like it says, it's years ahead of other horror movies. And I'll agree with that. I think it's a really solid horror movie. It's a movie that should be in your collection if you're into horror at all. And if you're into the history of horror particularly. You can't just fill up your collection with Freddy Krueger movies. Peeping Tom really dives deep into the voyeurism. And this is one of Scorsese's favourite films as well. And the interesting thing is Scorsese's editor for a long time, Thelma Schumacher, married Michael Powell late in his life. If you haven't seen Peeping Tom, you should. If you haven't seen it for a while, it's time to revisit it because you've obviously changed over the years. I could watch this every couple of years and still enjoy it and still get a lot from it. It's a must-see for me. And rewatching it was a good film experience for me this year. That then takes us to 1968 in a very different London and a very different world. I'll do the unboxing of this thing. I've talked about it. I paid my own money for this, by the way. Umbrella didn't send me this one, but you got a J card in there as well. I like a J card, even though they're quite awkward on the shelf. You got a slipcover. There's the slipcover, and there's your little poem that was on the original posters for the movie. And there's the little toy duck that the main character Martin steals at the start of the movie. Inside we've got some nice original artwork of the cover. This is Region B, by the way. And on the back you've got more, and there are a number of extras in here. There are 2 different versions of the movie. There's a 1.33 to 1 full frame version. There's also a 1.66 to 1 version, which was the original ratio. And even if you watch it on a big screen, you're still going to get tiny black bars on either side of the screen. You've got an audio commentary by English Gothic author Jonathan Rigby, and Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television editor Kevin Lyons. an interview with author and film historian Alan Jones and the original theatrical trailer. So it's a nice package, the way Umbrella does with these things. And I hadn't seen Twisted Nerve because it just wasn't available. I don't even know whether it got a DVD release in Australia, or a VHS release for that matter. But I like that artwork more than I like the other one, to be honest with you. This one is, again, another sick puppy guy from London. In this case, a guy called Martin, played by Hugh Bennett, the Welsh actor, who becomes obsessed with a woman called Susan, played by Hayley Mills. Now, Hugh Bennett and Hayley Mills had made a comedy a couple of years earlier called The Family Way, which also starred her father, John Mills. And they made another movie in 1971. I forget the title. I'll put it up here. But Twisted Nerve is a great film. Of course, it's got the Bernard Herrmann theme with that whistling, creepy music, which again was used in Kill Bill by Quentin Tarantino and in a couple of other things as well, which really adds to the eeriness. The character of Martin, played by Hugh Bennett, lives with his mother and his stepfather, who's quite wealthy. Martin has an older brother, about which his stepfather doesn't know. It's his mother's first husband's child, who lives in a home for people with Down syndrome. Now, there's a real problematic aspect to this movie, which is dealt with by a voiceover at the start of the film. They use the unfortunate previous name for Down syndrome in that disclaimer, which I'll play for you right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, in view of the controversy already aroused, the producers of this film wish to re-emphasize what is already stated in the film, that there is no established scientific connection between Mongolism and psychotic or criminal behavior.
And I don't like the way that that's read. I really don't like the way the guy says proven in that disclaimer. And there have been disclaimers put out since, because Martin's brother, who has Down syndrome, there's an implication that the genes that cause Down syndrome are related to the genes that make Martin a sociopath and his criminal tendencies, and his monomaniacal selfishness, and his dead set, aberrant belief systems about himself and other people. Now, at the start of the film, Martin goes and visits his brother Pete at the home and talks to the doctor who runs it. We see him later on because he's a geneticist who's interested in genetic abnormalities in people. And it kind of gives us that 1960s viewpoint of people with Down syndrome. The doctor talks about having trouble potty training people with Down syndrome and the fact that they don't live very long. And in the 1960s, I looked this up, in the 1960s, the lifespan of people with Down syndrome was quite low. It was like 30, 40 years. These days, it's a lot better because there are a lot better ways of assisting people with Down syndrome. But at the time, it was a short life and not one where people were treated with a hell of a lot of compassion. Martin goes to a toy shop and sees Susan, the Hayley Mills character, who's a librarian. She wants to become a teacher, but she's working in a library. And he kind of follows her around, steals a toy, and when they leave the shop, they're pulled up by store detectives as if they're kind of accomplices together. And Martin, when they're taken up into the office, pretends to be an intellectually disabled man who he calls Georgie. And the cops let him get away, but they get Susan's name and address, and Martin remembers that. And so he's got a way to contact her again because he's starting to become obsessed with her. He meets her at a library and pays her back the price of the toy that she paid for. And he kind of ingratiates himself with her by pretending to have an intellectual disability. Meanwhile, at home, his stepfather is not putting up with Martin's crap anymore, suggests to him that he goes to Perth in Australia and works on a sheep farm somewhere east of Perth. He doesn't want to do that, and he is then instead given 50 quid by his stepfather and thrown out of the house. He uses that strategically to build the plan that he has. Susan's mother, played by Billy Whitelaw, runs a boarding house. There are a few other people in there. There's an Indian student who's studying to be a doctor. There's a guy who works in film and television, played by Barry Foster. And it was this movie that Hitchcock saw And he cast Billy Whitelaw and Barry Foster in his movie Frenzy a couple of years later. And part of the tagline for this movie was the movie that scared Hitchcock. So by pretending to be Georgie, Martin turns up in the rain on the doorstep of the boarding house with a note purporting to be from his father, saying, "Can you please look after Georgie for a few days? I'm going away on business and I will pick him up and I will pay you," and there's money attached. And bedtime is 9:30. Reluctantly, because they've got this guy with an intellectual disability on their doorstep, the mother and Susan decide to put him up for a few days, and he slowly ingratiates himself with both of them in a very freaky way. Martin's a very twisted character. We see him earlier in his bedroom at the old house, where he has a bunch of muscle magazines and a bunch of books, including Kraft Ebbing's Psychopathia Sexualis, which I've read, and there's some really kinky things in the world. And this reminded me of another film, which I'm just going to go and get right now. A movie from 1965 with Sal Mineo and Julia Prowse called Who Killed Teddy Bear? And the main creepy character, Lawrence, played by Sal Mineo, in Who Killed Teddy Bear, also likes muscle magazines. And with Martin / Georgie, there's also the sense that he is unsure of his sexuality and becomes obsessed with Susan as if he's trying to prove to himself his heterosexuality. Now, that's one interpretation that you can make of this movie, and I think it's a valid one. So Martin ingratiates himself with the family. Meanwhile, he has decided to commit the perfect murder by killing his stepfather while he is ostensibly in France. He's arranged with the hotel where he was staying to have his letters forwarded to France and mailed from there. He slips a few quid to the desk guy, and he arranges that for him. And so Martin is supposedly in France, and so he couldn't possibly have killed his father. And we've got cats running around madly behind me. So as the obsession increases, there's also another aspect of this, because the mother, Joan, played by Billy Whitelaw, is having a furtive liaison with Jerry, played by Barry Foster's character. He kind of sneaks into her bedroom at night. Martin sees this and kind of sneaks into Joan's bedroom before Jerry can get there, telling her he has a nightmare and then curling up in her bed. So he's playing them off against each other, and he's ingratiating himself with Joan, who very clearly, in spite of the fact that Georgie ostensibly has an intellectual disability, he is starting to get the hots for him, and he plays up to that. He does a little bit of entertaining Mr. Sloane-like teasing to make her attracted to him. Things don't end well for a lot of the characters. It does end up in a bit of Rafifi and some murder, and a total mental breakdown for Martin. Unlike Peeping Tom, where Mark has a plan if he's ever caught by the police, Martin / Georgie has the opposite. He doesn't have a plan, but he does have a complete mental break and becomes Georgie as the cops break in on him. And that makes it kind of interesting. It makes it again like another movie that I know, a movie called The Psychopath, which ends with a very creepy scene with the murderer played by John Standing. And Georgie's little piece at the end feels a lot like that. There are little bits of other movies in this one. If you go back into the history of this kind of horror movie, there are a few borrowings and a few little nods to other films. But obviously, Peeping Tom is a superior film. But I think Twisted Nerve is a good, honest thriller of its time. It's also got some interesting little bits of business with the police inspector played by Timothy West, very fine English character actor, who gets to do a little bit of fun play. You also get Thorley Walters playing a teaching doctor at the teaching hospital where the Indian student who lives in the house works. He becomes confidant to Susan as well, because she's trying to understand what's going on with Georgie / Martin, and she slowly suspects something's going wrong. She finds the books that he has in his room and starts piecing things together. I like this one. I think it's a good, honest one. It was directed by Roy Bolting, one of the famous Bolting brothers, who ultimately at the time was having an affair with Hayley Mills, even though she was 33 years younger than him. He later on married her as well for a few years. So there's an interesting aspect to the backstory and the kind of behind-the-scenes stuff of this movie as well. But I'm not going to criticize anybody else for an age gap in their relationships because I have one myself. But just to finalize the two movies, I really like Peeping Tom. I want to find a better copy of that as well, because I think it's a good enough film for me to get the best quality copy I can. But for this one, this version of Twisted Nerve is as good as it's going to get for this film. It's got extra features on it. The transfer is crisp. It doesn't tell me what kind of original it was done from, but it is crisp. It's got just enough extras to keep us interested in the film. And it is the start of that particular kind of genre, as indeed is Peeping Tom, of that creepy, sick puppy, stalker of women kind of genre, which, of course, Psycho also had. And there are a couple of movies beforehand which very much soft-pedaled that aspect of things. These two are worthwhile. They're good, honest films. And if you do a compare and contrast with a number of Italian giallo films, I think you're going to be rewarded by watching both of these movies in comparison to those giallo films. But that's it for this time around. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video and you're not one of the 10,000, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think of these movies and whether you would see any other movies being comparable from that particular era, because it was an interesting start to what has now become a very well-trodden path and a very important subgenre in horror. You can also support the channel by donating at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Next time around, I've got the 10K celebration. Going to have a couple of movies to talk about. I'm going to be doing some giveaways to Patreon supporters and subscribers. I'm just working out how to do that at the moment. But in the meantime, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch some movies with some of the sickest bastards in cinema in them, and I'll catch you next time.